back. Our next session is called 1 + 1 = 3, a total war, 3 kingdoms campaign balancing post-mortem. And I have the pleasure to invite on stage Leif from Creative Assembly. Big round of applause for him.
Yeah, thanks Radu. Like you said, my name is Leif. I'm a senior game designer on Total War at Creative Assembly. And I want to talk about Total War 3 Kingdoms today. Excuse me. Okay. 1 + 1 = 3, a Total War 3 Kingdoms campaign balancing post-mortem. Essentially, I want to talk about some lessons learned from the balancing process of the 3 Kingdoms campaign. And before we delve into it, I brought a little video for those of you who are maybe not familiar with Total War or the So we released in May this year. It was pretty successful. We're very happy with that. We were the most played strategy game on Steam. But I'm not here to talk about any successes today. I want to talk about some lessons learned and some mistakes or maybe problems we identified. Because as you know, after a project, production starts to get into the post-mortem process, and then we thought on design side, hey, let's take the time and really look at the design of the game, the high-level concepts and how it ended up in the game, because that's not always the same, right? And then we had the benefit, of course, the game was released, so we knew what the players were thinking. We did intensive surveys with our QA experts, and of course, as designers, we looked at the beast we had created, basically. One thing, when people hear or talk about balancing, they often think, okay, that's about numbers, right? That's about maths and stuff like that. And yes, it's definitely important, but it's only one aspect of it. At least for the purpose of this talk, I want you to invite to see balancing as a set of 3 components, one of which, yes, the numeric balancing. We will talk about numbers a bit, but there were no Excel sheets used in the creation of this talk. Secondly, the system design, or precisely how the interaction between systems is designed. Basically the balance of important versus adjacent systems. And finally, when at the end of the game, at the end of production, your game is sort of complete, and then you want to massage it into the final form, into the most fun game it can be, that's also part of balancing. And the lessons learned that I brought with me today are essentially one for each of these components. And in all of this, we'll focus on the campaign side of Total War. I'll very briefly go into what that means, not so much the battle side. So yeah, very briefly, I'll talk about Total War 3 Kingdoms campaign. Can I have a hands up? Who of you are familiar with Total War? Okay, that's nice, almost half, that's quite good. Now I'll talk about the lessons learned and then wrap up with some takeaways. So Total War, it's a long-established franchise with, 13 or 14 titles now. I only say that because if you have a long existing franchise with a lot of titles, there are of course lots of expectations attached to it, lots of legacy features that people want. Some of you may know when we cut the family tree from Rome 2, it was an absolute outrage in the community. So keep that in mind with some of these thoughts perhaps. But Total War can be summarized as decisive battles on an epic scale. The uniqueness really of Total War is that in one moment, you're on the campaign map, you oversee your empire, your vast lands, hopefully vast. You enact laws and research technologies, you build buildings and infrastructure. But then next moment you zoom in and go into battle, you see your battalions marching over the battlefield, and you can maybe even zoom in further, look into the faces of your soldiers. But like I said, here we're going to focus on the campaign side of things. That's basically where the narrative of your story unfolds. And from a balancing perspective, it's interesting from two perspectives. One is battles are usually much more contained. Battles are fought in real time. It lasts between 7 and 15 minutes. So it's a bit more encapsulated, whereas the campaign is a long living ecosystem, you could say, 10 to 30 hours, depending on players. And secondly, it's primarily a single player experience. So some of these lessons here are definitely focused on the single player experience. For multiplayer, for competitive environment, of course balancing is a little bit different, but I think there's still something to be learned. So without going too much into detail, you need to know is on the campaign map in Total War, there are a lot of factions. The player is one of them. And these factions, they have to look after a lot of resources and metrics. So they have money, they have trade resources, they try to accumulate prestige, they might have resources specific to certain factions, obviously diplomacy, and they have a lot of characters and a lot of provinces to administer. And then these provinces, they have infrastructure and population and public order and food and taxation laws. And equally, characters have skills and loyalty and items they can equip, relationships with their own set of effects. So all in all, it means a lot of highly interconnected systems. Think about a situation, you might have two characters that you make generals in one of your army. And because of their personality, they become friends. Because they're friends, they're spreading support for you, so they make people more happy in your lands. If the people in your lands are happy, that attracts more people, so your population grows. More population means more taxes. So you have a long chain of causality where a decision or the impact on one end might actually be because of a cause very long down the chain. And that has a few cool opportunities because that makes it a very interesting strategic space, and it can also help to make it a bit more immersive and believable because of all the detail and all the detailed systems. Ideally, it's easy to learn, but hard to master. But there are also some pitfalls in that these vast causal chains that can also be very hard to decipher, especially for new players. That's what we internally call the effect soup, where if you try to maximize your income, you have to basically pull the best effects from a number of systems, and it all can be a bit swampy, you could say. And of course, exploitative or dominant strategies can ruin the experience overall. So in the end, it's hard to learn and easy to master. So because of these opportunities and pitfalls, of course, the balancing intent is very much at the core of the high-level design of the game. Very early we think about, okay, what features are important, how are features connected, and how does the progression feel like? Does maybe the balancing change as the player progresses? Does become one currency or metric more important or less important? So that's very important early on, but of course it's fine in theory, but in practice it can be a bit more difficult, and that's what leads me to the lessons learned. And first of all, I want to talk a bit about strategy. Total War is a strategy game. We tell people, hey, this is an awesome strategy game. And what does strategy actually mean? It's a plan of actions designed to achieve a long-term or overall aim. And specifically compared to tactics, tactics are the actual means used to gain an objective, while strategy is the overall campaign plan. So in short, strategy is basically what you want to achieve, your objective, and tactics is your actions towards it. What does it mean in games? In games, usually you think about strategy, it's about planning ahead, giving players choices to define their strategy, define their way to play perhaps, definitely reward players for planning ahead. And then, of course, it's the famous quote, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. It's important that players need to adapt their strategy as they go. And then when we looked at it, we thought, wait a minute, it seems like Total War and Three Kingdoms is no exception, is often more a tactical game rather than a strategy game. Of course, your decisions are very important. Do you build this building or that building? You want to maximize your income, but public order is currently low. How do you choose? There are a lot of difficult decisions to make, but often they are more tactical, more short-term. The goal is clear, so to speak, and if you ask questions, okay, does long-term planning really make a difference? Are you able to formulate long-term strategic goals? The answer is often no. But it does work sometimes, and I brought another video that does highlight some of it.
This is a horse pasture, ladies and gentlemen, a very unique little building. There are only 4 regions in the entirety of China which can build horse pastures. There's one here, a second one there, a third one there, and finally a 4th one is situated right over here, the other side of the mountains. And it is going to be our mission to collect those horse pastures. And you might be wondering, look Spiff, okay, why do you want to collect the horse pastures? The Qiang horse units are already 15% cheaper. How much cheaper can they get, and why would you want a horse pasture? Well, that's because horse pastures are very unique. As we can see, just having one of them reduces the recruitment cost of cavalry units by -5% and the upkeep of cavalry units by -5%. However, at the final level, it reduces the cost by 20%, meaning the upkeep of our horses and our Qiang cavalry is reduced by not only -15%, but it's increased to actually -35%. Quite good indeed, almost half the upkeep. However, if you then pick up this horse plantation here, and this horse plantation over here, and then finally this one over here, you might notice that suddenly you've stacked 4 times the 20% discount on horses, meaning horses are 80% cheaper to purchase and 80% cheaper to maintain. Well, this is where things can get very awry, because you can also decrease it even further, ladies and gentlemen. I know. You see, down here in the tech tree with barded mounts, the recruitment cost for cavalry sinks even more into -8, and you've also got hierarchical enforcement, so that's where you can have an extra army and all of your units go down 10% in terms of upkeep. So yes, today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be demonstrating to you how you can give yourself a completely free army, and by goodness is it fantastically fun.
So this is a video by Spiffing Brit, very funny, check it out if you want. He does these videos all the time for various games, it's usually quite hilarious. You can imagine, when I saw this, I didn't feel, happy about it. I thought, oh God, where did we mess up, oh, shame. But apart from the sort of slightly snarky title and everything, but if you think about it, he defined a cool strategic goal. He wanted unlimited horses, effectively, and he defined a set of tactical actions, sometimes strategic goals on their own, like capturing a set of key locations, researching specific technologies, then build up the infrastructure accordingly, and have the right people in positions of power in the government. So that sounded like a cool strategic plan. So we knew there was definitely strategy in Total War Three Kingdoms, but the question was, is it good enough or is it enough? And for that, I want to invite you basically on a little trip into strategy theory, you could say, and talk about 3 aspects of strategic decision making in games. One is the strategic decision space, then strategic exploitation and momentum. And if you're not working on strategy games yourself, just imagine basically trying to dissect the genre you're working in, like what's the core of these genres. And you will probably find that even if you're working in RPGs or action games, some of that actually applies because these games have strategic decision making as well. The strategic decision space is easy example, Civilization, different victory conditions. It's basically the variety of strategic goals that players can define. It doesn't have to be victory conditions. If your game only has one victory conditions, maybe it's very different paths towards it. If you think about RPGs, decision space is basically the number of viable builds that you have. Strategic exploitation is how much the game allows you to exploit synergies between systems or between strategic goals. If some of you maybe play paradox games, they're usually very deep in, to achieve something, you need to achieve a strategic goal beforehand, otherwise you have no way of getting there. If you ever tried a world conquest in EU4, it's basically, I don't know, like a doctoral thesis how to get there. Another good example is Slay the Spire, where you have your deck of cards and you have items that you find or purchase, and there's strong synergies between these so players can exploit this. Also, in light of recent events, I had to put the Diablo 2 skill tree in here. I think for its time, a brilliant skill tree, especially with the update, I think 109 or something, where they added the synergies in the skill tree. So skills you picked early wouldn't be wasted, they would build synergies with later skills, and was really rewarding. And finally, strategic momentum. Like I said, strategy is about planning ahead, so some of your actions should really have a long-lasting impact, momentum sort of, that you need to take into account. A good example is Battlestar Galactica Deadlock, where you jump your fleets around sectors, but without paying a penalty in fuel, you can't just jump away right away. So it's basically an investment. It's a commitment. You have to think about, is it really worth jumping there? And in the end, of course, players should be able to sort of use that to their advantage and exploit this momentum. And what we found is the main problems in Total War in general perhaps, but specifically about Three Kingdoms, is that the decision space is quite narrow. There's only one victory condition. There's basically only maybe 1.5 ways to build your economy. And your military can also not be specialized enough, perhaps. It didn't feel like there's a way to trade off quality with quantity, for example. Secondly, spoke about the effect soup earlier. The synergies sometimes felt a bit too soft. It wasn't like groundbreaking, like, oh wow, cool, if I do this, then I get this huge bonus that totally enables me to do something crazy. It was all sort of, more like an Excel sheet sensation, perhaps. And sort of as a consequence from that, individual decisions matter less, and they have less long-lasting impact. A good example to illustrate this a bit is the tech tree. It's a staple in Total War. I think all of them have a tech tree, or at least the recent ones. This is Shogun 2, released in 2012, I believe. See, it's pretty straightforward. The important part is that even though there are less technologies, all of them usually gave you something, like a new unit or a new building. And especially the technologies at the bottom 11, they were really valuable, but took a long time to achieve. So it was really a decision you had to make. Do I go for these? Do I unlock Matchlock Samurai, a very powerful ranged unit? And if you had this unit, that would totally change how you could fight battles. You would build your armies around this unit. You probably have to compensate for not having another special unit. Or you go for the economic bonuses on the right, and then you can go for quantity over quality, for example. By comparison, this is the tech tree in Three Kingdoms. Much more sprawling, much more technologies overall, and generally less effects, or less significant effects. And what we found is that players usually sort of have a pick and choose as you go behavior, like they always pick what they need in the moment, and we didn't get the feedback, and us ourselves felt the same, that you would go for certain specific core technologies that would enable you to do something really awesome in your game. In a way, this was intended. This is the original formulation from the high-level design from 2017, which basically said it is less about specialization, but more about balancing governance and nurturing the tech tree as a whole. So it was somewhat intended, because not all of your systems have to have lots of strategic depth or goals. So in isolation, it's okay, but what we found is that in Three Kingdoms, it's a more widespread phenomenon, that it's true for the skill trees as well, to some extent for the building trees. So we felt overall it could have been improved. Okay, the lessons learned. This is a really interesting one, because when we did this analysis, when we sort of first time questioned ourselves, are we actually a strategy game? We thought, okay, well, obviously next time we will make it really heavy on the strategy side. But can I ask you, how many of you have played chess, or better, who has not played chess in his life? No, everyone, very good. So we all played chess, but I would argue most of us, me included, play it as a tactical game. You look at your current move, you maybe plan 2 or 3 moves ahead, but I would argue that strategic gameplay in chess is out of reach for most amateurs, because strategy is complicated, it's really difficult. So our lessons learned here is not necessarily to go really hardcore on the strategy, but definitely be more clear about the strategic space, formalize a design for it. Obviously we have system design, and we talk about features and how they interact, and have an idea of how players interact with features, but we didn't have a proper design for basically these 3 components that I mentioned. Like, where's strategic momentum in your game? What are the strategic sub-objectives that players can formulate? Think about where you are basically between strategy and tactics. Obviously, some games go really deep on strategy, and that's cool, but obviously then you need to check, is it in line with your brand, with your overall player base? What do your fans want from it? So keeping it player friendly is definitely very important, especially if you decide to go very heavy on the strategic side. I think you probably need to spend more time on the UI to really help players to digest and understand all these connections. So the second lesson learned, gut fun first. Probably most of you saw the Blizzard presentation earlier, where Candace mentioned make it overpowered, and it's essentially the same. There's one cool story where quite late in development, sitting at my desk, and our game director was sitting behind me in the pod basically. He was leaning back and, "Hey Leif, yeah, well, the effects for this building still feel a bit shit." And this is the government support building in the residential district, and I think at the time it gave like 10% bonus to food production. And I tried to explain to him, look, this is balanced, right? This is otherwise it would be broken. This is actually, in the grand scheme of things, a very strong effect. And it all culminated in an argument in the parking lot outside. He's Hungarian, I'm German, you can imagine. But the point is that I'm trying to make, it doesn't really matter if your game is balanced. Again, multiplayer, different story. But in single player, it's not really, nobody will say, oh, this is a great balanced experience. You want players to make fun decisions and feel the fun. And strategy games especially, they're always very heavy on the cerebral fun side. Like, of course, you think things through, you make your plans, you see them unfold and get a lot of satisfaction from it. But the gut fun, basically the emotional fun, is still very important. And maybe it's just me or the people I know who typically do balancing, but there's always a lot of focus on making sure the player doesn't break the game, on restricting the player, whereas the focus should really be on, enabling the player, enabling cool strategies, enabling cool decisions. Essentially, make it overpowered. So, for example, this bonus here on the right, +2% replenishment. It's a regeneration of your troops. It might be perfectly balanced, but if a player sees +2%, like the gut emotional response to it, especially for a new player, is not exactly, oh wow, this sounds epic. And now you might say, well, just make it 10%, right? So what are you talking about? But of course, it's not that easy. You need to really ingrain this philosophy in your system design early to build systems that support big numbers, essentially, or reward a big sense of progression. Obviously, free-to-play games, some of the idle games, clicker games, do that very well because the whole gameplay is basically around this power growth fantasy where you get, +10 in the beginning and then later it's 10 billion and you feel sort of a rewarding sensation of growth. But it's not just mobile games or idle games. Like this one cool example, Kingdoms and Castles, a little city builder. They had exactly that, where in the beginning you build a lumberjack hut for 5 wood, and then you look around in your building options and you see the cathedral for 1,000 wood and 800 stone, and you don't even have any stone yet. So you can build this sensation of economic growth definitely into normal games as well. Equally, Riot, they always advertise their philosophy that every ability needs to do something really awesome and should feel special. Again, make it overpowered. Of course, that's not necessarily always easy to do and easy to balance. What we found that a few good sort of pointers towards emotionally rewarding responses are definitely unlocks. When you unlock a new toy, essentially, to play with, a new unit, a new ability, new items, big numbers, big changes, and then strong synergies between systems, especially if there's sort of this quest component to it where players can discover these themselves and feel like, okay, cool, I found this cool synergy. So some of that we definitely have in Three Kingdoms. We have unit unlocks, even though the feedback and also the internal opinion is that they are not meaningful enough, not quite enough. Obviously it has to do with some other design decisions, but it's not as strong as in some previous titles, perhaps. We have a lot of other unlocks as you go. We have this notion of gating, that you unlock more diplomatic options, more government posts as you progress through the game. So we have some of that, but overall, definitely the lesson learned is to focus more on that. Put gut fun first. I think we sometimes approach strategy games as building around the status quo right from the start, whereas you could approach it right from the start as something where the player progresses, where you have that economic power growth. And when I say economy, it doesn't always mean money, right? It can be any currency that the player deals with. And yeah, for that you need a progression-based system design that supports all this, and to think about the economic scaling. I mean, funnily, Civilization has done this since the first one, essentially, where you start your game, you have 5 hammers in your settlement, your temple takes 20 turns, later on the same settlement produces 80 hammers, so your temple produces in 1 turn. That's as simple as that. And then the gating of features, that's something we tried with Three Kingdoms for the first time, really. We want to definitely take it further because it helps with onboarding and accessibility and also gives a nice sense of progression. So final one, embracing the polished phase. Like I said, so your game is complete, feature complete, and you sort of now see what you've created, and you need to massage it into the right place. It's really important to stay focused and hungry during that phase. Has another little story from one of our designers. He was working primarily on diplomacy. Some of you might know diplomacy was one of the sort of flagship features for Three Kingdoms because fans had complained about it for a long time, rightfully so. So we really wanted to do something about it, but it also meant that the system and the implementation went through a lot of scrutiny at the end, right? So one day he sends out an email and says that the diplomacy tables in the database already have 40 revisions. How many more are needed to get it into the final state? And I mean, this frustration is, of course, mainly a leadership problem, right? You need to definitely make sure that the team stays hungry at the end. It's probably a talk on its own. I want to focus on more the practical side of things, the actual balancing at the very end. Because sort of as a baseline assumption for me or for us is that balancing is never good enough. Even if you think about the best, most polished, most balanced games, they usually have glaring balancing problems, but usually in areas that are not important. They're focused on the right things. If some of you may be old enough to remember StarCraft 1, my favorite game of all time, obviously had balancing problems at the beginning, but they focused on the right thing to make these three species play very differently. In that sense, the balancing, high-level balancing was absolutely brilliant. And then also would propose that you probably have the biggest gains in terms of balancing at the very end when all of your systems are in the game and working. Often you have a perfectly balanced system, and then let's say the latest feature that comes in sort of has strong hooks into it and might overthrow the whole balance. Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, when do you know when to stop? In German we have a term verschlimmbessern, which basically means you try to improve something here and over there, and you try to improve left and right, and in the end you end up with something that was worse. So in that sense, obviously can't treat it like a speedboat, you have to more treat it like an oil tanker. Be really clear about what is the course you want to take, and then put all the effort to really heave the thing around, and then slowly get there. And another German term, Schwerpunkt, from military strategy is also quite helpful. It basically says to concentrate one's forces at a point where a decision can be gained. So yesterday someone in that talk was speaking about value proposition, like be really clear about, okay, what is the core, what makes our game special, and that's probably where you need to put your most effort in to get that right. So for that you need the right intel to get the information, okay, are we on track? Are we going in the right direction? And then identify the core issues around it. And then lastly, probably the easiest part is then to fix these critical issues. In a way, of course, this is production 101, you could say, not rocket science exactly, but we found one tool that we didn't do before, which helped us on that, in that process. And for that, I have to take one step back. Total War in general is basically a story generator. It puts the player into a historical, sometimes fantastical setting in a sandbox, and you can, as a player, you can play out your own fantasy. You can rewrite history, you can write alternate history, and especially with Three Kingdoms, we wanted to put that even further and really focus on the characters in your game. The characters in your game and their connections, they were meant to tell awesome stories of personal drama. And for that we sort of came up with this idea, almost motivated from our fan base, because our fans, they, and obviously for other games as well, they write these things called after action reports, where someone would write down essentially their story and their campaign, often with a lot of literature, almost like text around it, screenshots and all that stuff. And we thought, okay, let's do that in-house. Let's ask our QA experts, designers to play through and create stories from that. And of course, for that, we had a clear intent in mind as well. I mean, what does a good story mean? That's always different, of course, and for us it meant personal drama, betrayal, revenge. We wanted players to feel like almost personally offended if they were betrayed in diplomacy, or felt growing attached to characters when they fought with them for many years. Excuse me. So we focused on the playthrough story, and essentially, is it worth talking about? Is it something you would tell your friends the next day at work or in school? Oh, well, you can't believe yesterday I played my Cao campaign and this and that happened. Essentially, we tried to focus on experience over function. So in that sense, it didn't matter if there were mechanical problems with certain features or maybe some things not perfectly balanced, as long as the resulting story was awesome. One interesting example is a playthrough by one of our devs. He played as Kong Rong, and he essentially did a food monopolist playthrough where he wouldn't have any armies, entirely pacifist, and he would trade food to other factions so they'd start to like him. And then he would start trading their regions for more food, and in particular he would trade their farmland for food. So very clever capitalist approach. And yeah, he did exploit a few things here and there, but we could see the resulting story was awesome. There was definitely something to talk about. Little caveat here, a few months, I think, after release, we had to nerf this a little bit because obviously our players were able to push it up to 11, so it was nerfed a bit, but it's still a good example for something where we knew, okay, probably a bit of a shaky balance maybe, but it was an awesome, fun story. So these playthrough stories also had another very positive effect, and that was that we knew we were on the right track, which is of course very important for morale. You're about to release a game. Sorry, I need some water. So we knew we were on the right track, but we also found some big issues around the end game. So yeah, cool. You had nice stories on the way through the campaign, let's say in your first 10 hours or so, your first 100 turns. But then in the end, it usually tended to fall apart because there was a total lack of challenge. Player usually had way too much money. There weren't any power blocks forming against him, so we knew, okay, this is definitely, this doesn't really hold up to any suspense. There wasn't any drama or story late in the game. So we looked very carefully at just the path towards the end game. I mean, what are the contributing factors to that? That's usually the economy. It's of course how well the AI is playing the game. I mean, were there maybe some problems around that? Was the AI just not good enough? And then finally, diplomacy. And instead of trying to fix things on all three sides, we did the oil tanker Schwerpunkt approach, so to speak, and looked carefully and then identified two issues in diplomacy where it was too easy for players to make vassals, and as a consequence, other factions didn't register the player as a threat, and there weren't the power blocks building that we wanted. We wanted, of course, to recreate the historical scenario of the Three Kingdoms where multiple huge power blocks were duking it out at the end. And once we changed these two issues, everything changed. Like the whole endgame scenario changed, and we had a nice, suspenseful endgame. So in that sense, we focused on getting the right intel to inform these sort of late decisions, you could say, late in development, I mean, And that can be very different depending on what game it is. For us, like I said, Three Kingdoms trying to generate personal drama, cool stories around characters. That was the focus here. And we wanted to focus on experience over function. I think that's probably the main takeaway here, that mechanical function is not as important by far as the resulting user experience. Then we identified core issues, talked about one example here, and then we were mindful about how to actually fix it. Because you can imagine, when we look at test runs, AI logs, and the QA feedback, and we see, okay, the player has too much money, then it's very easy to say, okay, let's make the economy more tight. But sometimes you have to resist these sort of first impression issues and really look deep, of course, what is the actual issue behind it. So the lessons learned here, to embrace this phase, sometimes there might be the notion that if production goes well, you don't really need a polish phase because everything should just be properly designed and implemented beforehand, right? It's just, of course, nonsense. Every game needs this polish phase, but you have to do it smartly, or we want to do it as smartly as possible. For that, you need a clear intent for the experience that the player will enjoy, and focus on experience over function. And then finally, staying hungry, again, more of a leadership problem, but I think it's really important that you're not wearing out at the end, but you really push through, because that will ultimately make your game, polish off the dirt from the jewel underneath. Not saying Three Kingdoms is necessarily a jewel, but you know what I mean. So to get to the takeaways, 1 + 1 = 3. Talked about 3 lessons learned, but more importantly, from a balancing perspective, 1 + 1 = 2 wouldn't be good enough. I think we should definitely see balancing as something that makes more out of the game's pieces than just its sum. And then finally, balancing is not really an exact science. Again, might be, or not might be, for multiplayer competitive balancing, you definitely need to go really heavy on data and analyze that really well. But for a single player experience, there's a lot of intuition and gut feeling, you could say, involved, and a lot of sort of really looking at the experience with the people you have to playtest the game. Oh. No? Oh dear. Could you please jump to the last slide? Sorry. No, not that one. This one. So as the main takeaways of this, definitely one important one for us to put gut fun first. Basically, the power, make it overpowered lesson from Candice. See balancing as something to enable the player, not restricting. And if you're doing strategy games, or maybe a game that is meant to have strategic components, think very carefully about, okay, where's your strategy? How's the balance between strategy and tactics? It's definitely, for us, really important to look at this more closely in the future. And then finally, embrace the polish phase, but be smart about it. We talked about really focusing on the core issues around the experience over function. And then finally, I think it goes without saying, but really try to treat QA not as the testers, but rather as laser-sharp tools that you use to really look at the most crucial parts of your game, build up expertise around them. Definitely helps. So yeah, thank you very much. And if you have any questions.
Cool. So I'm coming there.
Hi.
Hey.
I wanted to ask from the perspective of narrative design and content creation, what was the relationship of the team with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms book saga? Was it just an aesthetic wrapper and a historical period to create player stories? Or was there a temptation to start scripting things to have Xiao Xiao actually be at the battle where he was and that sort of thing?
Yeah, we had a lot of discussions around that because, I mean, first of all, so the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is the novel, the romanticized version of the history during the time. So it's basically, we always compared it to a Shakespearean story around historical events or maybe King Arthur's legend. So for us, that was a very important source because the Romance of the Three Kingdoms in China is still very much alive, as you probably know. It's very sort of at the core of the cultural legacy in China. So it was very important not to just look at the historical events, but also at the events in the romance of the Three Kingdoms, in the books essentially. But ultimately, Total War is, like I said, it's a sandbox experience. We want players to tell their own stories and not just relive a scripted narrative through the events of the books. So instead of saying, okay, we always want, I don't know, a Taishitse to be captured by Sun Jian as it happened in the books, we wanted to create systems that allowed players to tell this or similar stories. Basically look at, okay, what are the cool narratives that come out of the romance? And like I said, you know, these stories of betrayal, friendship, loyalty, revenge, that was then something we wanted to enable players to replicate through our systems, if that answers your question.
Perfect. In the other corner.
Hey, so a little bit of context. I've been playing Total War games for over 10 years, I think, and my favorite ones are the old ones, actually, around Total War and Medieval. And one of the reasons is that they had some really cool mechanics. One of them is the population, which you guys removed but implemented in this one, in Three Kingdoms. I want to ask, how did you guys see this? Was it a good move or not? Do you plan to expand on it or do you plan to remove it again? Was it a success or not? Thank you.
So first of all, we knew, of course, that our fans generally like the notion of population because it makes the world more believable. It puts a layer underneath the player's actions that makes the world more believable and more immersive. Secondly, historically in China at the time, population was very important. There was lots of migration going on. Having population in your areas was very important for food provisions for your armies and of course taxation. So it really made sense from the historical point of view to make it a system. On the other hand, like we discussed earlier, the focus was really to capture these personal stories. So at the same time, in terms of systemic balancing, we knew that yes, we want population, but it's not meant to be a core player or a core actor, you could say. And that's why we chose to have a population system that was capturing the immersive narrative, you could say. There was definitely a benefit of having population. Players were able to somewhat tailor their economy around having population or not. But it wasn't as core, you could say, as in previous games. But population is also a good example for basically the problems mentioned at the beginning with the effect soup, with a bit of unclarity in the strategic space, because I think it was a system that wasn't as intuitive as the old one. So I think it's definitely can be done better.
Hello. So I've got a small question about the flags. When did you decide to put the flags in? It's fluff, good fluff, very good fluff. But was it in the QA stage when they tested and it needed something extra, or before from the designing?
No, that was very early. and I think it would have been impossible to add it in late. It was very early because, you know, if you look at films around the era, I mean historical films in general, but if you watch Radcliffe or some of the other reference films that we had, you know, these cool oceans of flags above your troops. I mean, that's so integral to, I mean, some of you might have seen Hero, for example, well, also lots of flags, and it's just very core to that fantasy of ancient China especially. So it was pretty obvious we had to do it. Yeah?
Will they be added in Warhammer 3?
Excuse me. I can't talk about that.
Do we have one more? Yeah, there.
Hey, so I think it's a fair assumption to expect for a player to have a lot of game knowledge in order to enjoy your game to the fullest. So how do you tackle that for, let's say, onboarding or getting new players in the game or getting lapsing players get back into the game and quickly to the previous levels?
Yes, so in terms of onboarding and tutorialization, the core concept that we wanted to push forward with Three Kingdoms was the concept of gating. I previously talked a bit more about it, a bit about it already. Basically the idea that you start the game more simple, and as you go it becomes more complex, so that you would not require an extensive tutorial, you would not require a prologue campaign. Because we found in the team for Three Kingdoms, we didn't necessarily find that tutorials really help with the onboarding process, because many players bounce off if they have to go through a tutorial first, and instead we wanted to make it part of the main journey. We did sort of somewhat succeed in that. What we learned through UX testing very late was that you still need a tutorialization for some really basic stuff. I mean, we had people not knowing how to move an army with left click, right click, people trying to drag armies around, people not being clear that it's a turn-based game, that they have to end turn to progress. So some really sort of fundamental assumptions that probably for a fan base pretty obvious, but for that you still need a tutorial. But for the overall experience, what we will continue to push forward is the concept of gating, that the game starts more accessible. And I think that works really well for some of the mobile games as well. If you think about Civ, I mean, Civ has it a bit easier because of their starting situation is inherently easier in each game. But you start and it's pretty straightforward. You have one settlement, you don't have any government forms yet, you don't have governors, you don't have complex military units. And I think it's a great example how even a complex game can use gating to start more simple and make it more accessible in that process. Any more questions?
There's one more.
Hi, so one question, you talked a bit about how some exploits, even though they're exploits and they're bad or they can be very bad, they can also turn into fun experiences or things that if they're tweaked, they're actually very good to have in the game. And it seems to me that sometimes these exploits can just be synergies that weren't thought of to begin to be that powerful or something like that. So did you ever, I don't know, think of building down from that? Like, of course the game is very big and it has a lot of strategy and tactics to it at all, but also thinking that besides the regular way to advancing in the game, you actually have a couple of these exploits that you build in the game to begin with, and also then if you know about it, you can apply a rock, paper, scissors to it and break it down to keep the feeling of, wow, I found this out, but still sort of keep it under control.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of what I said with formalizing the strategic space. Basically formalize these strong strategies or exploits, you could say, to then inform the actual content design for some of the systems. I think it's definitely a good approach. It's a bit like you'd probably in an RPG think about builds you want to enable, and then you build your skill tree from that. And similarly here, I think it's definitely a very interesting approach to think about, okay, what kind of economic strategies do we want to enable, and really formalize that, write that down and have it clearly as a testable concept. Because, I mean, obviously we talked about, okay, you should be able to play as a Venice in China by dominating a trade empire, but it wasn't formalized enough so that, you know, it was communicated across a team of you know, 100 people, and all the testers were aware of it and stuff like that. So really formalizing these strategic goals, I think, is a very good idea.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Thank you, Leif.
Thank you.
Leif.